I think anybody following the news would be aware that China is hot. The G7 meeting in Cornwall, Mr. Biden has made it very clear that he regards relationships with China as absolutely central. Whether we cooperate, whether we have conflict, whether Western countries try to contain China. I mean, these are the big issues of the day. I just made clear for myself, I'm not a China expert. I don't speak Chinese. My own involvement started maybe 25 years ago. I used to work for Shell, the oil company. I did scenario planning and looking at the future of China at that stage was one of my key jobs. When I went into the government, as Steve just mentioned, I was in the British cabinet. The coalition relations with China were a big part of my work. Building up trade and investment between Britain and China. Since I left government, since I left politics, I'm now doing academic work. I've got a book coming out on China in September. But let me set the context. I think it's probably good I just set my prejudices out to start with, so you know where I'm coming from. I'm looking at the economics of China, but economics and politics overlap. I was very much involved in what we called the golden era. We had good relations with China at the beginning of the decade. My overall approach to China is I'm optimistic about their economy. There are different views, and we'll debate those in a few minutes. But let me just explain the economic context where we're dealing with. This is a very crude depiction of the economic size of different countries and roughly where we've got to. The blue lines is the sort of conventional way of looking at the world as the GNP, the size of countries. And as you see, the United States is numero uno, followed by China, followed by Japan, Germany, and India. But increasingly, I think we've felt this isn't a proper representation of the world because countries have distortions of prices, their exchange rates don't necessarily reflect reality. And the World Bank and the IMF and the United Nations use something called purchasing power parity-based GNP as a more accurate measure of the size of economies and therefore ultimately their importance in economic terms. And you'll see from that on that basis, China is now by some measure the biggest economy in the world. And India, interestingly, is number 3, not the way we traditionally think of it. Now, we can argue till the cows come home about which is the more accurate measure, but I think a rough compromise would be to say China and the United States are now the economic superpowers, and they're of roughly the same importance. I say I'm what's called a Dengist, not that I'm a member of the Chinese Communist Party or anything like that, but Deng Xiaoping, as most of you will know, brought in a program of radical economic reforms after the death of Mao in the late 1970s. And it was the reforms that Deng brought in, allowing markets to operate within China, allowing peasants to sell their products in the market rather than have rules imposed by central government, opening the economy to trade, to foreign investment, to new ideas, to technology. That transformed the Chinese economy, which has grown by leaps and bounds in the last 4 decades, 10% growth much of the time. But Deng's belief is that you could combine economic liberalization, a market economy, with the rule of the Communist Party to provide, as he saw it, stability and order. And he has miraculous achievements. Hundreds of millions of people in China have been lifted out of poverty, but he is politically brutal and authoritarian. He was the person who gave the go-ahead to the Tiananmen Square massacre. It's not talking necessarily about nice guys here. But the Dengist approach that you could combine successful capitalist economy with an authoritarian rule under the Communist Party has worked, contrary to many Western ideas that you have to have democracy and successful market economy together. One doesn't work without the other. Dengist took a different view, and I agree in practice that that's what happened. And the fundamental approach of the Chinese under his leadership and his successors has been to ensure that the state is competent, that it does stuff. Quite unlike the Soviet Union, which was collapsed and was incompetent. I mean, it was not just repressive, but it was highly inefficient. A crucial point which relates to my overall approach to this problem is I do believe in what we call international public goods. They're shared problems. Climate change is an obvious one, stopping nuclear proliferation is another, having rules around international trade, having rules around the management of the oceans, another, governing the way we operate in space. All of these require rules, what I call international public goods, and we have to work with the Chinese to develop these. And if we don't have them, we have conflict. And a lot of these problems like climate change are never addressed. But what we are seeing in the last few years is a great hostility to China, partly because internal authoritarian measures, President Xi, things that have caused great anger, anguish in the rest of the world, the way that the Hong Kong protests were dealt with, amongst other things, have led to a polarization, treating China more as an adversary than an ally. But I want to focus on the economy. Well, there is an argument between people who are optimistic, I would say I was one of them, the bulls, and the bears who are pessimistic. I mean, a lot of people would argue that China is now a middle-income country, but living standards about the level of sort of some Eastern European countries, maybe Portugal, something like that. But it's a bit misleading because the coastal areas are phenomenally developed, almost developed country levels. They're 200, 300 million Chinese who live at Western living standards, but it's a very poor interior. But on aggregate, it's a middle-income country. And some people argue that China is trapped in that position. Their population is beginning to decline. Certainly the workforce is beginning to decline as a result of their so-called one-child policy, which is very severe. People weren't allowed to have more than one child. They were fined if they did. It's now been relaxed a bit, but as a consequence, they've, as it were, run out of surplus labor. And that's been used to argue that they're now in a middle-income trap, amongst other factors. But they have, the immediate situation is that China has been the first out of the traps in terms of recovery from the COVID pandemic. I just make a contrast here between what happened last year in the world economy with the virtual collapse, the worst crisis we've had since records began, and all the major economies, as you see, and I've got the United States, the Eurozone, the UK, India, Japan falling by 8 to 10% in that year. China uniquely began to recover and is now growing strongly, as is, of course, the UK and the US beginning to catch up. And the contrast with a decade ago, when we also had an economic collapse following the financial crisis, it was China in particular, but also India, which weren't affected by the collapse of the banking system, grew very strongly, and arguably pulled the world out of recession. But in the course of this expansion, which we've seen particularly in recent years, there's been a growing worry about Chinese debt. And let me just explain what I mean by that. These are IMF figures looking at the different elements of debt for different countries, a mixture of personal debt, the orange color, which is corporate debt, business debt, and the yellow, which is national debt, public sector debt. And China's overall level of debt is a bit lower than the world average, but it's growing quite rapidly. But you see that the orange column is very large. A lot of Chinese companies were persuaded by the government to invest very heavily, particularly in the last decade. That's what drove the world economy forward at the back of Chinese recovery. And they borrowed money, often very carelessly, from banks and what are called quasi-banks, shadow banks. And as a result, a lot of Chinese companies, state enterprises in particular are heavily laden with this inherited debt. But skeptics would say, I've quoted a man called Mr. Orlick, who I think is Bloomberg's economic advisor. He asked the question, why does this debt bubble never burst? I mean, we had a debt crisis in the UK and the United States. It did burst 10 years ago. The Japanese had an appalling financial crisis, 1990, as a result of the accumulation of debt. But it's not happened in China. And it could be, I think certainly this is the case, that the government's basically competent. There is quite a lot of state control in the Chinese economy. They're regulating the banks and these so-called shadow banks very carefully. They're converting debt into market instruments, bonds, and have so far ensured that this debt bubble doesn't burst. But they do have a problem, which is that Chinese growth is driven by investment, government investment and private investment. Consumption is relatively weak. They are, of course, developing a society of affluent consumers in the coastal areas. As I said, about 200 million people who operate with very sophisticated payment systems and social media use in shops and so on. But for the most part, consumption is relatively undeveloped in China. And they're very conscious of it. And by investing very heavily, they've been piling up more and more debt. And they know this is a problem they have to deal with. And I show in a graphical way roughly what's happening here. You see the orange bars are the share of the national economy, which is accounted for by investment. And in the crisis period 10 years ago, the Chinese just invested massively. They developed this extraordinary, high-speed train system. The cities grew out of nothing. Enormous amounts of housing development, highways going everywhere, massive investment. But they overdid it, and they realized they've now got to consume more and invest a bit less. And in the last few years, this has started to happen. But there's still a country that, relative to Western countries, invests, quote, too much and consumes too little. And that's the big challenge for policymakers in China. One big difference between China and the Soviet Union, rather crucial, is that whereas the Soviet Union was basically incompetent, it was also highly repressive. People with effectively a kind of open prison. People found it very difficult to come in and out. Larger numbers of Chinese travel every year, 150 million or so. They go out, they come back. Despite the repressiveness of the regime, the Chinese middle class, the professional class, is well informed, international in its outlook. And this, of course, is one of the factors which contributes to its considerable economic success. Now, the Chinese model, different people describe it in different ways. It's probably best described as state capitalism. In other words, it's a combination of a very strong private enterprise sector. We're doing a million companies, most of them very small. But the biggest ones have a substantial amount of state control. The heads of big companies are allowed to criticize the government publicly. And the most important of them, Jack Ma, has recently been cut down to size politically, but he's still allowed to become a billionaire. So it's a constrained private sector combined with a state sector, which they're trying to operate more on kind of market principles, allowing big enterprises to shut down when they go bust. They've become a little bit more cautious about that now, but trying to get this balance between an entrepreneurial state and a constrained private sector. But the Chinese authorities, although they're highly political and they're engaged in a big debate with the West about democracy and its whether it's a system that works or not, their primary concern is with making sure that their economy works, because as long as living standards rise and people are more or less fully employed, the Chinese system has a sort of basic legitimacy. The Chinese Communist Party playing the role that the emperors played in ancient China, is stable in power. So having a successful economy is fundamental to the way the system operates. But and I just mentioned at the bottom that what's happening right now is we've got a president who is much more politically authoritarian, controlling than his predecessors, but still believes in having a reasonably open economy. He's just admitted some of the American big banks, asset management institutions like BlackRock, JP Morgan have just been welcomed into China. But they also have what's called dual circulation. They're increasingly worried that the Western world is retreating from engagement with China and they're building up self-sufficiency. I just describe here the sort of change in mood that's taken place within the last few years. When I was actively involved, there was, I call it El Dorado, certainly a belief that China it was in our interest that China expanded. We should look at the business opportunities. More and more people now presenting it as an economic threat, particularly in the United States. Trump, America First policy was integral to that. Worrying about imbalances in trade, and China certainly has run large trade surpluses, particularly the United States, though these have fallen in recent years. A lot of the anxiety in the American working class, which led to the rise of Trump, could be attributed to globalization, international competition, of which China was part. There's a lot of mixed evidence on this. Technology probably was more important than trade, but nonetheless, it didn't help. The Chinese were accused of manipulating their currency to make it more competitive. That was certainly true in the past, no, it's no longer the case. And a lot of complaints from business, including in Europe, that this successful state capitalism is unfair competition with our companies. Certainly true. I dealt with cases of British companies that were having a hard time in China, and many of the allegations were true. But what the Chinese would say is that they are now regarded by the World Bank as one of the most business-friendly countries in the emerging economies, certainly much more than countries like India and Brazil. And they are liberalizing. They are dealing with things like intellectual property in a much more capitalistic way than they used to. So I'll move on quickly. I've only got a few minutes, but what is happening at the moment, and to my mind is quite worrying, is that there is a rapid decoupling of Western economies, including ours, from China. Trump started it with his tariff war. We've had the exclusion of Huawei, the big telecoms company. I dealt with a lot when I was in government. They dealt with highly sensitive telecommunications data, but certainly our people were confident that they were carefully managed. There were no risks to national security. The British government under Theresa May tried to get a compromise with the new wave of technology, 5G, which enabled Huawei to contribute its very advanced system, and they're probably the most advanced telecoms company in the world, in some of the peripheral activities, but to keep the core British, so that there wasn't a security issue. But the Americans under Trump effectively barred Huawei, and we had to follow suit because we couldn't get American components. There is now a battle going on over semiconductor supply, particularly the very advanced chips. The most important company in the world is based in Taiwan, which makes it particularly sensitive at this time. And there is a sort of semi-sanctions policy going on at the moment to try to stop the Chinese getting access to the most advanced components in this sector. Following the Hong Kong demonstrations, sanctions are brought in, and there have been moves in the United States, haven't yet been followed here, to stop Chinese companies listing on American stock exchanges, because they're still there. There is a lot of money, and to try to discourage Western pension funds from investing in China, but that so far hasn't made any difference. Let me just finish with the UK retreat from the golden era, as I call it. We had a very flourishing period of rapid expansion of trade and investment. The Chinese invested in the British steel industry in South Wales and saved that company from collapse. Car companies, electric car companies in Coventry, British companies heavily engaged in China, Jaguar Land Rover, AstraZeneca, my old company Shell do very well in China. But there is now a raiding back on it. I mentioned the retreat in respect of Huawei. Brexit has closed doors. The Chinese no longer see Britain as a sort of gateway to Western Europe. The Hong Kong events of the last 2 years have made things more difficult. The British, I think quite rightly, said to people in Hong Kong who are afraid of the communist government that they can come and live in Britain. The Chinese regard that as interference, and relations are polarized. But in economic terms, in terms of financial markets in Hong Kong, very little has changed. Britain has brought in some new foreign investment rules to screen foreign investment, effectively to stop Chinese companies taking over British high-tech companies. It's perfectly reasonable, in my view, to do that. But of course, there are also other companies, including American companies, taking over British high-tech enterprises and taking their technology. I feel somehow we should be a bit more neutral on that, but that's a key change. And a big question for the future, two big questions. With the Chinese are investors in the Hinkley Point power station. They're just investors. It's run by the French company EDF. But they, as part of the package, there is an understanding they will build a nuclear power station at Bradwell. A lot of people in the UK who are hostile to China are worried that we don't want the Chinese as part of our nuclear power sector. There are clearly security questions there. And not least, universities, very heavily dependent on overseas Chinese students. I encounter many of the London School of Economics. Many of them make a major contribution, both financially and intellectually, to British universities. But there's been a growing nervousness about where this is ultimately leading. And I'll just finish with the politics of all this. We're getting something like an atmosphere around a new Cold War. Public opinion has hardened. The Chinese are being blamed for the COVID. There is an argument about where ultimately the infection came from. And we're getting what I call an unholy alliance, people on the left and liberals, conservatives, Trumpists, united in a kind of anti-Chinese front, I would describe it. You're getting a sort of military alliance. It isn't yet formulated, but the outline of one is there, which links the United States with India, which would be a big departure, certainly with Australia. Vietnam, another communist country, but offering bases to Western countries, the United States, despite the war in the past. They have a long-standing enmity with China. Very ambiguous attitudes in Europe. The Germans do extremely well out of exporting cars and capital equipment to China. They don't want to get caught up in this new Cold War. The French have a similar ambiguity. But we get increasingly these arguments about human rights, particularly the Uyghur minority, the Tibetans. The Chinese say there's nothing to do with you, the rest of the world. This is a matter of our territorial integrity. It's part of China. Don't interfere. And they, of course, categorically deny there's anything like a genocide there. There was set amount of evidence of abuse of human rights. And they, of course, in the West, we place more emphasis on self-determination for minorities who want to rule themselves. That's becoming a very fraught area of political conflict. And then, are the Chinese aggressive, or are they mainly concerned with their own internal development? With the three big flashpoints at the moment, which are on the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, and the future of Taiwan, they're all at least part of China. Taiwan is independent in practice, but legally part of China. So, but the argument about assertiveness relates to their territorial approach to the South China Sea, for example. And certainly the Chinese have been very active in Africa through overseas development, investing far more in infrastructure than the West has done. And some people see that in rather sinister terms. Others see it as China doing what the West isn't doing, simply putting more capital into an emerging continent. And then finally, Taiwan, potentially a flashpoint that the mainland Chinese regard Taiwan as part of China. They say it's got to ultimately come under the same umbrella. There have been threats of military intervention, though at the present there's little evidence on the ground that they're contemplating it. But if there were a flashpoint with China leading to war, it would be around Taiwan.